I'm not really the type to post stuff online, but I feel like I need to get this off my chest. My name is Melissa, and I'm from a small town near Des Moines, Iowa. Life has never been particularly eventful, which is honestly how I like it. I've always been a pretty low-key person. Nothing too exciting going on, just the usual work, family, and friends. A couple of years ago, though, things took a weird turn that I never saw coming. So, a while back, I was dating this guy named Ryan. We met through mutual friends at a local bar, and things seemed okay for a while. He wasn't exactly what I would call a catch, but we had some good times. He was funny, kind of charming in his own way, but also a little too intense at times. Like, if I didn't text back right away, he'd start sending question marks or follow up with phone calls until I responded. At first, I brushed it off as him being overly attentive, but as time went on, it became more suffocating. He'd ask me who I was with all the time, why I hadn't invited him to hang out if I was just with friends, stuff like that. It got tiring. I'm not one for drama, so when it all started to feel too much, I just told him I wanted to end things. It wasn't some big blowout fight or anything. I tried to be mature about it. I explained that it just wasn't working for me and that I needed some space. He seemed to take it okay at first. He didn't really argue or try to talk me out of it. He just said something like, "I get it," and we parted ways. I honestly thought that was the end of it. I didn't think much about it afterward. It was a clean break, or so I thought. Fast forward a few months, and I was living my life as usual. Work was going fine. I was hanging out with my friends, just doing normal stuff. I had almost forgotten about Ryan entirely. But then I started noticing some strange things happening. It began with small stuff, like random people on social media sending me weird messages, asking me why I was acting crazy, or saying things like, "You should just leave him alone." I had no idea what they were talking about, so I ignored it at first, figuring it was some kind of mistake or misunderstanding. But then it got worse. My friends started asking me if I was okay because they had been getting strange texts from me, only I hadn't sent them. Apparently, someone using my name and phone number had been messaging them, saying weird things about how I was still obsessed with Ryan, how I couldn't move on and stuff like that. Some of my friends showed me screenshots of the messages, and I was honestly shocked. The messages didn't sound like me at all, but they were coming from a number that looked just like mine. I had no idea how that was even possible. At first, I tried to laugh it off, thinking it was just some prank or glitch. But it kept happening. And it wasn't just with my friends. People I barely knew, people I hadn't talked to in years, were messaging me, asking why I was reaching out to them. Some even accused me of sending them angry or desperate texts about Ryan. It was all completely insane. I thought maybe my phone had been hacked, so I changed all my passwords, reset my phone, and even got a new number, hoping that would solve the problem. It didn't. Things escalated quickly after that. One day, I was at work when I got a call from the police. They wanted to speak to me about a restraining order that had been filed against me. I was absolutely floored. They told me that Ryan had gone to the police and filed a restraining order, claiming that I had been stalking him for months. He had apparently shown them all kinds of evidence, texts, emails, call logs, all supposedly from me, threatening him and saying all kinds of crazy things. They even said he had a few witnesses, people who backed up his claims that I had been harassing him. I was completely blindsided. I hadn't spoken to Ryan since the breakup. I hadn't even seen him in months, and here he was, painting me as some kind of psycho ex-girlfriend. I couldn't believe it. I tried to explain to the police that none of it was true, that I hadn't contacted him at all since we broke up. But the evidence was stacked against me. It was like walking into a nightmare. Everything felt unreal. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyer consultations, court dates, and endless stress. I had to fight to clear my name, and it felt like I was living in some alternate reality where nothing made sense. Ryan had fabricated everything. He had faked texts, emails, and even call logs to make it look like I had been tormenting him. He had gone so far as to create fake social media accounts pretending to be me, sending messages to himself and his friends. And somehow, it all looked legitimate enough to get a restraining order against me. The worst part was that some people actually believed him. Even people I had considered friends started to distance themselves from me. I could see it in their eyes. They weren't sure what to believe. Some of them outright told me that they didn't want to get involved, that they didn't want any drama in their lives. It was humiliating. I felt like my reputation had been completely destroyed, and there was nothing I could do to fix it. I spent months fighting to get the restraining order overturned. I had to hire a lawyer, gather evidence to prove that Ryan was lying, and go through the hell of seeing him in court multiple times. Every time I had to walk into that courtroom and see his face, I felt sick to my stomach. He would just sit there, calm and collected, while I felt like I was falling apart inside. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to destroy me, and in a lot of ways, he succeeded. Eventually, I was able to prove that Ryan had fabricated the evidence against me. My lawyer was able to show that the texts and emails had been sent from fake accounts, and we even found out that he had convinced some of his friends to lie for him in court. The restraining order was dropped, but the damage had already been done. My reputation was in tatters, and the whole ordeal left me feeling paranoid and anxious all the time. Even though the court ruled in my favor, people still looked at me differently. There were whispers and rumors going around town. Some people thought I had gotten away with it, and that the only reason the restraining order was dropped was because of some technicality. It was infuriating, but there was nothing I could do to change their minds. Ryan had succeeded in planting that seed of doubt in everyone's head, and it was impossible to undo. I tried to move on with my life after that, but it wasn't easy. Everywhere I went, I felt like people were watching me, judging me. I started withdrawing from social situations, avoiding places where I might run into people who knew about the whole situation. I felt like a ghost of my former self, constantly on edge, never really feeling at ease. Even though I hadn't done anything wrong, I couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was just waiting for me to slip up, to prove that I really was the person Ryan had made me out to be. To make matters worse, I started receiving strange packages in the mail. At first, it was just little things, anonymous letters with vague threats, random items like broken sunglasses or dead flowers. I had no idea who was sending them, but I couldn't help but think that Ryan was behind it. It felt like he was still trying to mess with my head, even after everything had been settled in court. But I had no proof, and the police couldn't do anything without evidence. I moved to a new apartment a few months later, hoping that a change of scenery would help me get a fresh start. I didn't tell many people where I was moving, and I changed my phone number again, just to be safe. For a little while, things seemed to calm down. I tried to focus on work and rebuilding my social life, even though it was hard to trust people after everything I had been through. But then, one day I came home to find my front door unlocked. My heart sank as soon as I saw it. I had double-checked that door before leaving for work that morning. I knew for a fact that I had locked it. I walked inside slowly, my hands shaking, trying to convince myself that maybe I had just forgotten. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside my apartment. I checked every room, every closet, under the bed. Everything was exactly where I had left it, but that didn't make me feel any better. The sense of violation was overwhelming, even though there was no clear sign that anything had been taken or moved. I called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing to suggest that anyone had actually broken in. They told me that it was probably just a mistake on my part, that maybe I had forgotten to lock the door or that the lock had malfunctioned. But I knew better. Something was off. After that, I became even more paranoid. I started checking the locks on my doors and windows multiple times before leaving the house, sometimes going back to check again even after I had already locked up. I got a security system installed, complete with cameras and motion sensors, hoping that it would give me some peace of mind. But it didn't. I was constantly on edge, always waiting for something else to happen. The packages kept coming, too. They weren't frequent, just sporadic enough to keep me on my toes. Sometimes months would go by without anything happening, and I would start to relax a little, thinking that maybe it was all over. But then another package would show up, or I'd get a strange phone call from an unknown number, and all the anxiety would come rushing back. I never found out for sure who was behind the packages or the phone calls, but I always suspected it was Ryan. He had shown that he was willing to go to great lengths to mess with my life, and I had no reason to believe he had stopped. The restraining order may have been dropped, but that didn't mean he couldn't continue his games in more subtle ways. He was smart, careful enough not to leave any real evidence behind. As time went on, I did my best to rebuild my life. I started therapy to deal with the anxiety and paranoia, and it helped a little. I got back into some of my old hobbies, reconnected with a few friends who had stuck by me throughout the whole ordeal. But I never really felt like I could fully relax. There was always that lingering fear in the back of my mind, that sense of uncertainty about what Ryan might do next. Even now, years later, I still get the occasional strange phone call or letter, and every time it brings me right back to that dark place. I never really thought this could happen to me. I always figured stories like this were exaggerated or maybe only happened to people who lived in big cities, where anonymity made things like this possible. I live in a pretty quiet neighborhood in the suburbs of Seattle. It's one of those places where everyone kind of knows each other, but not too well, just enough to say hi when you're walking your dog or when you bump into someone at the grocery store. You know, typical suburban life. It's always been calm and relatively uneventful here, which is exactly why I chose to live here. I was dating this guy named Greg for almost a year. We met through mutual friends at a house party. And at first, things were great. He was charming, funny, and seemed genuinely interested in me. It didn't take long for us to start spending a lot of time together, and eventually we became pretty serious. But over time, things started to change. Greg became more controlling, more possessive. He would constantly ask me where I was, who I was with, and why I wasn't answering his texts right away. It started to feel suffocating. And after a while, I knew I needed to end things. So I did. It wasn't a dramatic breakup or anything like that. I tried to keep it as calm and respectful as possible. I told him it just wasn't working out and that we needed to go our separate ways. He didn't take it well, but I didn't expect him to. He begged me to stay, said he could change, that he would be better. But I had already made up my mind. I knew I couldn't be with someone who made me feel like I was being constantly monitored and questioned. So that was it. I thought he would move on eventually, like most people do after a breakup. For a little while, it seemed like he had. I didn't hear from him for a couple of months after we broke up, which I thought was a good sign. I went back to focusing on work, seeing friends, and trying to get back to my normal routine. I wasn't looking for anything serious after Greg, just trying to enjoy some time on my own. It felt good to be single again, to have that freedom to do what I wanted without having to answer to anyone. Then one day, I was at the grocery store picking up some things after work. I remember it was a Wednesday, kind of late in the evening. I was tired and just wanted to get home and relax. As I was walking down one of the aisles, I saw Greg out of the corner of my eye. He was a few feet away, looking at something on one of the shelves. At first I thought it was just a coincidence. Seattle isn't that small, but it's not uncommon to run into people you know in town. So I brushed it off, grabbed my stuff, and checked out. But then I saw him again a few days later. This time, I was at a coffee shop near my apartment, one that I go to pretty often. I had just sat down with my coffee when I saw Greg walk in. He didn't come up to me or anything, but he glanced in my direction and then went to order his drink. I remember feeling a little uneasy, but again, I told myself it was probably just another coincidence. Maybe he started coming to this coffee shop after we broke up. No big deal, right? It wasn't until I saw him for the third time that I started to feel really unsettled. This time, it was while I was out for a run in my neighborhood. I usually run in the evenings after work, nothing too intense, just a few laps around the block to clear my head. As I was running down one of the streets near my place, I saw a car parked on the side of the road. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I got closer, I realized it was Greg's car. He was sitting in the driver's seat, just staring at me as I ran by. I didn't stop or acknowledge him, but my heart started racing. It was then that I started to wonder if this was really just a coincidence or if something more was going on. After that, I started seeing him everywhere. It wasn't every day, but often enough that it started to freak me out. I'd go to the store and he'd be there. I'd be at the gym and he'd show up. I'd go for a walk and I'd see his car driving by. It started to feel like no matter where I went, he was always nearby. I tried to tell myself that it was all in my head, that I was just being paranoid. But the more it happened, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that he was doing this on purpose. One night, things escalated. I had been out with some friends for dinner, and by the time I got home, it was pretty late, around midnight. As I was getting out of my car and walking up to my apartment, I noticed someone standing in the shadows near the building. I couldn't see who it was at first because it was so dark, but as I got closer, I realized it was Greg. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there watching me. My stomach dropped. I didn't know what to do, if I should confront him or just go inside and lock the door. I decided to go inside and lock the door. I didn't want to make a scene or escalate things. I just wanted to get away from him. Once I was inside, I called one of my friends to tell her what had happened. She was worried and told me I should call the police, but I wasn't sure if that was the right move. What would I even say? That my ex was standing outside my apartment late at night? It didn't seem like enough to involve the police, but things didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing other strange things happening. I would come home to find my front door slightly ajar, even though I knew I had locked it before leaving. Nothing was ever missing or out of place, but the fact that someone had been in my apartment was enough to send me into a panic. I installed new locks, but it didn't help. I kept finding my door unlocked, and I started to wonder if Greg had somehow gotten a key to my place. Maybe he had made a copy while we were still together. The thought of that made my skin crawl. I started getting paranoid. Every little noise made me jump. Every shadow outside my window made me feel like someone was watching me. I barely slept. I kept thinking about what Greg might be capable of. He had always been a little off, a little too intense, but I never thought he would take things this far. I started carrying pepper spray with me wherever I went, just in case. I even thought about getting a restraining order. But again, I wasn't sure if I had enough evidence to justify it. One night, I came home after a late shift at work. I was exhausted and just wanted to crawl into bed and forget about everything. But as soon as I walked into my apartment, I knew something was wrong. The air felt different, like someone had been in there recently. I checked all the rooms, and nothing seemed out of place. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On my kitchen counter, there was a small bouquet of flowers. They weren't there when I had left for work that morning. I didn't know what to do. I stood there staring at the flowers, trying to make sense of what was happening. My mind was racing. How had Greg gotten into my apartment? How long had he been there? Had he been waiting for me? I felt like I was losing control of my life. Like no matter what I did, he was always one step ahead of me. I called the police this time. I had to. I told them everything. The unlocked doors, the flowers, the fact that I kept seeing Greg everywhere. They took a report, but there wasn't much they could do without concrete evidence. After that, I started staying with a friend for a while. I couldn't bear the thought of going back to my apartment alone. I felt safer at her place, but that didn't stop the nightmares. I kept dreaming about Greg showing up in the middle of the night, breaking into my friend's house and coming after me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, and it would take me hours to calm down enough to fall back asleep. Eventually, I moved out of my apartment altogether. I couldn't stay there anymore. I found a new place on the other side of town, one with better security and a gated entrance. I didn't tell anyone except for a few close friends where I was moving. I even changed my phone number and deleted all my social media accounts. It's been a while now, and I haven't seen Greg anymore. The strange incidents also stopped. This all started after I broke up with Tom. We'd been together for almost 2 years, and things started off great, as they usually do. He was attentive, caring, and always seemed to know exactly what I needed. But over time, his behavior started to shift. He became more controlling, constantly wanting to know where I was and who I was with. It was subtle at first, like casually asking what I did that day and getting irritated if I didn't mention every single detail. Then it turned into him accusing me of hiding things from him if I didn't text back fast enough, or if I went out without inviting him. I began to feel like I was suffocating. I ended things after realizing that I couldn't continue living like that. He didn't take the breakup well, but it wasn't some huge dramatic blowout either. He kept texting and calling for a while, asking for another chance, trying to convince me that he could change. I ignored him as much as I could, hoping he would eventually get the hint and move on. After a few weeks of the same old routine, him calling, me ignoring, it finally stopped. I remember feeling relieved, like I could finally breathe again. I thought that was the end of it. For the next year, my life went back to normal. I threw myself into work, spent more time with friends, and even started dating casually again. Nothing serious, but it felt good to get back out there. Portland has plenty of spots for that. Bars, cafes, concerts. It's a chill city, and I've always liked that about it. But then, strange things started happening. It began with little things that I brushed off at first. My bank account showed a couple of small charges I didn't recognize. like subscriptions to services I'd never signed up for. I figured they were mistakes. Maybe I'd accidentally signed up for a free trial and forgot to cancel it. I disputed the charges and had them refunded, thinking nothing more of it. Then I noticed that some of my mail was missing. Important stuff like bills and bank statements never arrived. I assumed it was a glitch with the post office. It happens, right? But when I went to check with them, they told me my address had been changed. I was floored. I never authorized any change of address. I immediately contacted the Postal Service to correct it and made sure my mail was rerouted back to my apartment. Again, I thought it was just some random mix-up. But looking back now, it was clear that something much worse was happening. A couple of weeks later, I got a call from my bank. They wanted to verify a loan application that had been submitted in my name. I was stunned. I hadn't applied for any loans. When I told the bank that, they put a hold on the application and said they'd investigate. I was starting to get scared at this point. Identity theft crossed my mind, but I couldn't figure out how it had happened. I had always been careful with my personal information. I rarely used my credit cards except at trusted places, and I always shredded any sensitive documents before throwing them away. That night, I sat in my apartment and tried to piece it all together. The strange charges, the missing mail, the loan application. Someone was pretending to be me. But how? I didn't tell anyone about it at first. I guess I didn't want to admit that something this serious could be happening to me. I just wanted to fix it quietly and move on. But things kept escalating. My credit card company called me about suspicious activity on my account. Large purchases were being made in cities I hadn't even been to: Seattle, San Francisco, even New York. I didn't recognize any of the transactions. My bank accounts were drained, and I was left scrambling to prove that these purchases weren't mine. It was humiliating, trying to convince the bank that I wasn't some irresponsible person who'd maxed out her credit cards on luxury items and flights to places I'd never been. I had to cancel all my cards, change my passwords, and file police reports. It was a nightmare, but I thought I was finally getting a handle on it. Then, one day I got a knock on my door. It was a process server with court papers. I was being sued for unpaid rent. Apparently, I had rented an apartment in Seattle under my name and skipped out on several months of rent. I was completely floored. I'd never even been to Seattle in the past year, let alone rented an apartment there. My name was on the lease, though. They had my social security number, my signature, everything. I couldn't understand how this was happening. My mind was spinning. Who the hell was doing this? It was then that I started thinking about Tom. I hadn't heard from him in over a year, but the timing of all this felt too coincidental. He was always good with computers. He worked in IT and knew his way around hacking and stuff like that. He used to joke about how easy it was to steal someone's identity online, but I never thought much of it at the time. Now, though, it was starting to make sense. I couldn't prove anything, but I had a gut feeling that he was behind this. He must have been tracking me somehow, gathering bits and pieces of my life over time, and using them to destroy me from the shadows. I hired a private investigator to look into it. I felt like I was losing my mind and I needed answers. The investigator traced the fake apartment lease back to an address in Seattle. It was a small, crappy apartment in a rundown part of town, nothing like the kind of place I would ever live in. But when the investigator went to check it out, the tenant had already moved out. The landlord didn't have much information, just that the person who lived there claimed to be me and had signed a year-long lease before disappearing. What really scared me, though, was that the investigator found out that whoever had been pretending to be me was still out there, still opening accounts and applying for loans in my name. They were using my identity to build a whole new life for themselves. I felt completely violated, like my entire existence was being hijacked by someone else. It wasn't just about the money or the credit cards anymore. It was about my sense of self, my autonomy. I didn't know who I was anymore, and I didn't know how to stop it. I tried going to the police, but there wasn't much they could do. They took my statement, but without hard evidence pointing to a specific person, their hands were tied. Identity theft cases are notoriously difficult to solve, and I was just one more victim in a long line of cases. They suggested I get a lawyer, so I did. But that didn't make me feel any safer. It just felt like another layer of bureaucracy that I had to wade through to reclaim my life. Things continued to spiral. I started getting calls from debt collectors, demanding payment for loans I had never taken out. My credit score was destroyed, and I had to spend hours on the phone with banks and credit agencies, trying to clear my name. It felt like a never-ending battle, and I was exhausted. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my life unraveling in front of me. Everything I had worked for, everything I had built, being torn apart by someone who had decided to become me. I started feeling paranoid all the time. Every little thing made me anxious. If I got an email that seemed even slightly suspicious, I panicked. If my phone rang and I didn't recognize the number, I ignored it. I stopped using social media altogether. I didn't want to give whoever was behind this any more information than they already had. I changed all my passwords again, even though I knew it probably wouldn't help. It was like trying to plug a leaking dam with my bare hands. No matter what I did, the water kept pouring through. The investigator continued digging, but progress was slow. Whoever was doing this knew how to cover their tracks. There were no obvious clues, no clear trail to follow. It was frustrating beyond belief. I just wanted it to stop, but I felt completely powerless. Then one day I came home to find a strange package waiting for me. There was no return address, and it wasn't something I had ordered. Inside was a cheap burner phone and a handwritten note. The note said that I should call the number programmed into the phone if I wanted to make it all stop. My heart was pounding as I stared at the phone. I didn't want to call. I didn't want to engage with whoever was doing this. But at the same time, I was desperate. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next disaster to strike. I sat with the phone in my hand for hours, trying to decide what to do. Eventually, I dialed the number. It rang a few times, and then a voicemail picked up. The voice on the other end was distorted, like it had been run through some kind of voice-changing software. It said that I had made the right choice by calling, that if I followed their instructions, everything would go back to normal. They told me to wire a large sum of money to a specific account, and to never try to trace the call or the account. If I did, they said, I would never get my life back. I hung up and sat there in silence for what felt like hours. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call the police again, but I knew they wouldn't be able to do much. I didn't have the money to pay off whoever this was, but even if I did, there was no guarantee that it would make them stop. This person had already taken everything from me, my money, my credit, my peace of mind. What was stopping them from continuing to mess with me even after I paid? I didn't wire the money. Instead, I went back to the private investigator and told him about the phone call. He said it was a good sign, that it meant whoever was doing this was getting desperate. They wanted something from me, which meant they were slipping up. But that didn't make me feel any better. I just wanted my life back. I didn't want to play this game anymore. I ended up moving out of Portland a few months later. I couldn't stay there. Every time I walked down the street, I felt like someone was watching me, like they were waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. I couldn't live like that. So I packed up my things and moved to a small town in Washington, hoping that a fresh start would help me regain some sense of normalcy. But even now, I still don't feel completely safe. I'm constantly checking my bank accounts, my credit reports, my mail, always looking for signs that it's starting again. I haven't received any more strange packages or phone calls, but I know better than to let my guard down. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who would end up writing something like this. I used to scroll past these kinds of stories online and think, how could something like that happen to someone? But here I am, sitting in my small apartment in Chicago, typing this out because I feel like I need to get it off my chest. I'm still trying to make sense of everything that happened, and maybe writing it down will help. I don't know. I guess it's worth a shot. It all started about a year ago. I was dating this guy, David. We had been together for almost 3 years, and at first, things were pretty good. We met at a work event. I'm a graphic designer, and he was in sales at the same company. He was charming, funny, and seemed really into me from the start. It felt nice to be with someone who was so attentive, you know? At least that's how it felt in the beginning. As time went on, though, David's attentiveness turned into something darker. He became possessive, controlling in subtle ways that I didn't even notice at first. He'd get annoyed if I went out with my friends without him, or if I didn't answer his texts right away. He always had this way of turning things around so that I felt guilty, like I was the one doing something wrong. He never got violent, but the emotional manipulation was constant. He'd make me feel like I was lucky to be with him, like no one else would put up with me the way he did. I stayed with him for longer than I should have because I kept thinking things would get better. I thought if I just tried harder, if I was more understanding, he'd go back to being the guy I fell for. But it didn't work. Eventually, I reached a breaking point and decided to end things. It wasn't easy, and he didn't take it well. He begged me to stay, promised he'd change, but I knew I had to get out for my own sanity. So I ended it, and I moved out of the apartment we shared. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought I'd finally be able to move on with my life. For a few months, everything was quiet. I focused on my work, spent time with my friends, and started to feel like myself again. I wasn't looking to jump into another relationship right away, but I felt relieved to be free of David's control. I started going out more, reconnecting with people I had distanced myself from during the relationship. Life was starting to feel normal again. But then, weird things started happening. It started with my job. I worked for a small design firm, and I loved it. My coworkers were great, and I had built a good reputation for myself over the years. But out of nowhere, I started hearing rumors that I was difficult to work with, that I was unprofessional and unreliable. At first, I didn't think much of it. Office gossip happens everywhere, right? But then my boss called me into his office and told me that clients had been complaining about me, saying that I was rude in emails and missed deadlines. I was shocked. I hadn't missed any deadlines, and I always prided myself on being professional with clients. I asked to see the emails, and when my boss showed them to me, my heart sank. They were emails sent from my company account, except I hadn't written them. The emails were filled with rude comments, dismissive responses to client requests, and in some cases, straight-up insults. I had no idea how this was happening. My boss believed me when I told him I hadn't written them, but the damage had already been done. A few clients pulled their business from the firm, and I could tell my boss was starting to lose trust in me, even if he didn't say it outright. I changed my work email password and hoped that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The next thing I knew, my friends started distancing themselves from me. I noticed that people weren't replying to my texts or invites to hang out. When I finally confronted one of my closest friends, she told me that I had been sending them weird, angry messages for weeks. She showed me screenshots, and again they were messages from my phone number, but I hadn't sent them. The messages accused my friends of betraying me, said awful things about them that I would never say in a million years. I felt like I was losing control of my life. No matter how many times I tried to explain that I wasn't behind the emails or the texts, people started pulling away from me. It didn't matter that I swore up and down that I had nothing to do with it. There was something in their eyes, like they weren't sure if they could believe me. I started feeling paranoid all the time, like I couldn't trust anyone. I even started questioning myself. Was I going crazy? Was I somehow doing these things without realizing it? Things escalated from there. One day, I came home to find that my apartment had been broken into. Nothing was stolen, but everything was trashed. My clothes were thrown all over the place, my drawers had been emptied out, and my laptop was smashed on the floor. The police came and took a report, but they didn't have much to go on. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing valuable had been taken, so they didn't seem to think it was a priority case. They suggested it might have been a random act of vandalism, but I knew better. I knew it had to be David. I didn't have any proof, though. Every time I tried to explain to the police that I thought my ex was behind all of this, they said there wasn't enough evidence to pursue it. David had always been careful, never leaving any direct links back to him. I felt trapped, like there was nothing I could do to stop him from destroying my life piece by piece. The breaking point came when I lost my job. My boss told me that despite his best efforts to defend me, the firm couldn't afford to keep losing clients because of the issues surrounding me. I was devastated. I had worked so hard to build my career, and now it was crumbling in front of me because of something I had no control over. I tried to explain again that I wasn't behind any of the emails, but at that point it didn't matter. My reputation was ruined and no one wanted to work with me anymore. After losing my job, I became more isolated. I stopped going out, stopped talking to most of my friends. I couldn't trust anyone, and I didn't want to burden the few people who still stuck by me. I felt like I was being watched all the time, like David was just waiting for me to make a move so he could tear me down even more. I knew he was behind all of this, but I didn't know how to prove it. It was like he was always one step ahead, always finding new ways to sabotage me without leaving any trace. Then came the final blow. One night I got a call from my landlord telling me that he had received multiple complaints about me from the other tenants. Apparently, I had been making loud noises late at night, blasting music and having people over at all hours. None of it was true, of course. I had been keeping to myself for weeks, barely leaving my apartment except to get groceries. But the complaints kept coming, and eventually my landlord told me that he had no choice but to evict me. I tried to explain that someone was targeting me, but by that point, no one cared. I packed up what little I had left and moved into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. It was all I could afford after losing my job, and I didn't have anyone I could stay with. I was completely alone, living out of a suitcase in a dingy room with no idea what to do next. I felt like David had won. He had taken everything from me, my job, my friends, my home, and I had no way to fight back. I tried filing for a restraining order, but without solid evidence that David was behind everything, it was denied. The police still wouldn't do anything, and I didn't have the money to hire a private investigator or lawyer. I was stuck, trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I wish I could say that things got better, that I found a way to turn it all around. But the truth is, I'm still here, still living in that motel, still trying to figure out how to piece my life back together. Every day, I wake up and wonder what new disaster David has planned for me. I check my phone constantly, dreading the next wave of fake messages or emails. I can't sleep at night, afraid that he'll show up and do something worse than just trash my apartment. I don't know how to stop him. All I know is that he's out there, watching, waiting for his next opportunity to ruin me even more. And there's nothing I can do about it. This happened about a year ago. I just moved to Chicago after breaking up with Mark, my ex. I don't want to get into too many details about him, but let's just say that our relationship wasn't good, especially near the end. Mark was controlling. At first, I didn't even notice it. It started with small things, checking my phone a lot, asking where I was going, and wanting to know who I was with. He disguised it as concern, like he was just looking out for me, but over time, I started feeling suffocated. It escalated from there into full-blown arguments if I even hung out with friends without telling him in advance. Eventually, it reached a point where he was tracking my location on my phone. He said it was for safety reasons, but I knew it wasn't. It was about control. He needed to know where I was at all times. When I finally worked up the nerve to leave him, it wasn't easy. He fought me on it. For weeks, he tried convincing me to come back, saying he'd change, saying he loved me and couldn't live without me. It was a mess, but I stood firm. I knew I couldn't stay with him. I needed to get out of that toxic environment. So I left. I moved to Chicago for a fresh start. The city was perfect for it, big enough that I could disappear into the crowd, anonymous in a way that felt freeing. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood far away from where Mark and I had lived. It wasn't anything fancy, but it felt like mine. It was my space, and after everything with Mark, I needed that sense of control back in my life. The first few months were peaceful. I started a new job at a marketing firm downtown, made a few friends, and generally felt like I was getting back on track. I started to feel like myself again. The apartment became my little sanctuary. I decorated it how I wanted, filled it with plants, and spent lazy weekends binge-watching Netflix or reading books on my couch. Life was simple, and for the first time in a long time, I was happy. But then, things started to feel off. Not all at once, but in subtle ways that I dismissed at first. It began with little things like objects in my apartment not being where I thought I left them. I have a pretty good memory, and I'm generally a neat person, so when I found my hairbrush on the opposite side of the bathroom or noticed my coffee mug was moved slightly on the kitchen counter, it threw me off. But I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. Maybe I was just being scatterbrained with the stress of the movie and settling into a new routine. Then, I started waking up in the middle of the night, feeling uneasy. At first, I thought it was just stress or bad dreams, but it wasn't just that. I felt restless. I'd wake up sweating, my heart racing for no apparent reason. It happened more and more frequently, and I was exhausted during the day because I wasn't sleeping well at night. I tried everything: melatonin, meditation, deep breathing exercises. Nothing worked. One night I was lying in bed, tossing and turning, trying to will myself to sleep, when I noticed something strange. There was a faint red light coming from the smoke detector in the corner of my bedroom. Now, I'd never paid much attention to the smoke detector before. It's one of those things you just assume is there, but never really think about. But that night, the red light caught my eye, and it seemed to be blinking in an odd pattern. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. But the more I stared at it, the more anxious I became. Why was it blinking? Was it low on battery? Was there a fire risk I wasn't aware of? I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about it. I ended up grabbing a pillow and blanket and sleeping on the couch that night. I told myself I'd check it out in the morning. The next day, I went to work like normal, but the thought of that blinking light was stuck in my head all day. When I got home, I decided to check the smoke detector. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and stood on it to get a closer look. When I opened the cover, I expected to see a battery or some wiring, but instead, I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a small camera lens embedded inside the smoke detector. It wasn't part of the device itself. It had been placed there. Someone had rigged the smoke detector to hide the camera. I jumped off the chair and just stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to process what I was seeing. My mind raced. Who put it there? How long had it been there? Was I being watched? By who? My first thought was Mark. He'd always been obsessed with knowing everything I was doing. But this was a whole new level of invasion. I grabbed my phone and immediately called a friend. She told me to get out of the apartment and call the police. So that's exactly what I did. I packed a small bag and left as quickly as I could, not even bothering to lock the door behind me. When the police arrived, they took the camera down and searched the rest of my apartment. I could barely breathe as I watched them go through every room. The whole time, I kept thinking about all the private moments I'd had in that space, showering, changing clothes, sleeping. Someone had been watching me during those moments. It was nauseating. The police found 2 more cameras. One was hidden in the living room, tucked inside a decorative vent cover. The other was in the bathroom, hidden behind a wall socket. I felt violated in ways I can't even begin to explain. It was like someone had ripped away every sense of privacy and safety I'd had in that apartment. I moved out the next day. I couldn't stay there after knowing what had happened. The police started an investigation and I gave them Mark's information, but nothing came of it. They couldn't prove that he was the one who put the cameras there. I hadn't seen or heard from him in months, so there wasn't any direct link to him, at least not one they could find, but deep down I knew. I knew it was him. After I moved out, I stayed with a friend for a while until I could find another place, but even in her apartment, I didn't feel safe. Every time I looked at a smoke detector, a vent, or any small opening in the wall, I felt paranoid. Was there another camera? Was someone still watching me? I couldn't stop checking for hidden devices. I'd lay in bed at night, my eyes scanning the ceiling, looking for anything out of place. I installed my own security cameras in the new apartment I eventually moved into. Not because I thought it would stop anyone from spying on me, but because I needed some sense of control back. I wanted to be the one doing the watching for a change. It's been a year now, and while things have gotten better, that experience changed me. I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe in my own home again. It's like a shadow that follows me everywhere I go. This constant awareness that my privacy isn't guaranteed. Every noise, every blink of a light, every misplaced object sends me spiraling back into that fear. I don't know if Mark will ever face consequences for what he did. The police didn't find enough evidence to charge him with anything. I guess he was smart about it, covering his tracks well enough to get away with it. But I can't stop thinking about all the times he watched me without me knowing. All the moments he was there, silently observing my life without my consent. It's a violation that sticks with you, haunts you, even when you try to move on. 2 years ago, I ended things with my ex, James. We'd been together for almost 3 years, and at first, things were good. But slowly, his jealousy began to creep into every corner of our relationship. He would get upset if I went out with friends, constantly accused me of talking to other guys, and became obsessive about knowing where I was at all times. I'm not naive. I saw the red flags early on, but I tried to work through them. I thought he'd change. He didn't. When I finally ended it, he didn't take it well. He showed up at my apartment a few times after I broke up with him, pleading for another chance. When that didn't work, he turned angry. I stopped responding to his texts and blocked him on social media, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. A few months after the breakup, things started to get weird. At first, it was just small things like seeing his car parked near my work or getting anonymous messages on my new social media accounts. The messages were vague, things like, "I see you," or "You can't hide forever." I ignored them, assuming they were just spam or random trolling. But then something happened that shattered any sense of security I had. One night I got an email from a random account I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Thought you should see this." Normally, I would have just deleted it, but something about it caught my attention. I opened it and I wished to God I hadn't. Attached to the email was a video. I clicked play and it took a second to register what I was seeing. It was me. The video was of me. It had been recorded during a very intimate moment with James, a video I had shared with him when we were still together. I remember we had agreed to delete it afterward, and he assured me he did. Clearly he hadn't. My stomach dropped, and I felt like I was going to be sick. I stared at the screen, completely paralyzed. This couldn't be happening, but it was. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I called a friend, shaking as I told her what had happened. She told me to report it immediately, so I did. I contacted the website where the video had been uploaded, flagged it, and sent desperate emails pleading for it to be taken down. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. I didn't go to work. I couldn't face anyone knowing that there was a video of me out there circulating on the internet. I felt violated in a way I can't even put into words. It wasn't just that my privacy had been invaded. It was the sense of powerlessness. The video was out there and I had no control over who was seeing it. After what felt like an eternity, the site finally responded and took the video down. But the damage was done. It had been up long enough for it to be shared, downloaded, and saved by God knows how many people. I tried to reassure myself that maybe not that many people had seen it, but I knew better. Once something is online, it's out there forever. I thought that was the worst of it, but I was wrong. A week later, another email showed up in my inbox, this time from a different account. The subject line simply said, "More where that came from." My heart sank as I opened it. There was another video attached, another private moment James and I had shared. It felt like he was taunting me, reminding me that he still had more footage, that he could release it whenever he wanted. And worst of all, there was nothing I could do to stop him. I tried contacting him, begging him to leave me alone, but he never responded. Instead, the emails kept coming. Every few days, I'd get another one, each containing a new video or threatening message. It was relentless. I started living in constant fear. Fear of what he might release next, fear of who might see it, fear of losing everything I'd worked for. And then, the inevitable happened. One of the videos made its way to my workplace. I don't know how it happened, but someone got a hold of it and shared it with my boss. I was called into a meeting and confronted about it. I tried explaining the situation, that it was all done without my consent, but the damage had already been done. My boss told me they couldn't have that kind of exposure in the company. I was let go the same day. Losing my job was devastating, but what hurt even more was the way people started treating me. Word spread quickly, and soon it felt like everyone in my social circle knew about the videos. Friends I had known for years started distancing themselves from me. People looked at me differently, like I was tainted. I tried to explain that it wasn't my fault, that I was the victim, but it didn't matter. The damage to my reputation was done. I spiraled into a deep depression. I stopped going out, stopped talking to people, stopped doing anything, really. I felt trapped, like no matter what I did, James still had control over me. The emails kept coming, and each one was a fresh reminder that he wasn't done with me yet. I didn't know how much more I could take. At some point, I decided to go to the police. I filed a report, gave them all the emails and videos, and begged them to do something. But even though they were sympathetic, there wasn't much they could do. James hadn't directly threatened me, and since I had originally consented to the videos, it was a gray area legally. They advised me to get a lawyer, but I couldn't afford that after losing my job. So, I did what I could to protect myself. I changed all my passwords, deleted my social media accounts, and got a new phone number. But it felt like trying to put out a wildfire with a glass of water. No matter what I did, he always seemed to find a way to get to me. It was like he was one step ahead, always knowing how to hurt me in the worst possible ways. The worst part was the isolation. I couldn't trust anyone anymore. Every time I made a new friend or tried to start over, I was paranoid that they'd find out about the videos or that James would somehow get to them. I felt like I had to constantly look over my shoulder, waiting for the next blow to come. It was exhausting. I don't know how long this went on. Months, maybe? Time became a blur during that period. Every day felt like I was just trying to survive, to keep my head above water while James continued to drown me. There were days I thought about just disappearing, leaving the city, maybe even changing my name. But I didn't have the money for that, and deep down I knew that running wouldn't solve anything. James would still have the videos, and he would still have that power over me. Eventually, the email stopped. I don't know why, and I didn't want to question it too much. Maybe James got bored, or maybe he found a new target to harass. Whatever the reason, the silence was almost as unnerving as the harassment had been. I kept waiting for the next email to come, for the next video to surface, but it didn't. Slowly, I began to crawl out of the hole I had been living in, though I was far from feeling normal. I found a new job, though it was a major step down from what I had before. My social circle shrunk to almost nothing. I kept to myself, not wanting to risk anyone finding out about my past. The paranoia never really went away. Even now, I'm constantly checking my inbox, waiting for another email to appear. I live with the fear that one day the videos will resurface and I'll have to go through it all over again. But the worst part? The part that still haunts me every day? It's knowing that James got away with it. He ruined my life, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. He's out there, living his life while I'm left picking up the pieces of mine. I can't shake the feeling that he still has those videos, just waiting for the right moment to use them again. I never thought I'd be someone who would write something like this. I always read posts online, horror stories people share about break-ins or creepy encounters, but I never thought something like that would happen to me. I guess no one ever does until it's too late. This happened about a year ago. I had just ended things with Tyler, my ex. It wasn't an easy breakup by any means. We had been together for a little over 2 years, and it wasn't healthy. Toward the end, things got really bad. He became possessive, controlling. He'd check my phone constantly, question me about who I was with, where I was going, even if it was something as simple as going to the grocery store. The final straw was when he followed me one night when I went out with some friends, just to make sure I was where I said I'd be. It was terrifying, and I knew I had to get out. Breaking up with him wasn't easy. He didn't take it well. There were nights where he'd show up at my door, banging on it, begging for me to take him back. Other nights, he'd send me a barrage of texts, alternating between telling me how much he loved me and how much he hated me. It was exhausting. I blocked him on everything: social media, my phone, even emails. I wanted to move on and start fresh. I changed the locks on my apartment in case he ever tried to come back. For a while it worked. I didn't hear from him and things started to settle down. I was living in Portland, Oregon at the time. My apartment was small, a one-bedroom in an older building, but it was cozy and felt like my own space. I loved it there. I was finally getting back to some sense of normalcy. I even started going out with friends again and enjoying my time alone. I thought I was finally moving on from everything with Tyler. But then one night everything changed. It was late, probably around 1 a.m., and I'd gone to bed early because I had work the next morning. I remember feeling peaceful for the first time in a while, like I was finally getting some restful sleep after everything that had happened. But something woke me up. It wasn't a loud noise or anything, but this strange sense of being pulled from sleep, like something wasn't right. I opened my eyes, and that's when I saw him. Tyler was standing at the foot of my bed. I froze. It took my brain a second to register what I was seeing. It felt surreal, like some sort of nightmare. But the fear that shot through me was too real. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at me in the dark. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I knew it was him. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest, I thought it was going to explode. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but I was paralyzed with fear. I don't know how long I stayed like that, just staring at him, trying to process what was happening. I kept thinking, how did he get in? I had changed the locks, and there was no sign of forced entry. Then I remembered. I had a spare key hidden in a small plant outside my front door, something I had put there months ago in case I ever locked myself out. He must have found it. I don't know how long he had been in my apartment. The thought made me sick to my stomach. Had he been watching me sleep? Had he gone through my things? Was this something he had done before? My mind was racing with all these horrible possibilities, and I still couldn't move. Eventually, Tyler took a step closer to the bed. I don't know what snapped in me, but I finally found my voice. I screamed, loud and raw, hoping someone in the building would hear me. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and fumbled to unlock it. Tyler didn't say anything. He just stood there watching me as I called 911. I didn't look away from him, my hand shaking so badly that I could barely speak to the operator. I told them that someone had broken into my apartment, that he was standing in my bedroom. The operator told me to stay calm, that officers were on their way, but it felt like it took forever for them to arrive. Tyler still hadn't moved. He just stood there, staring at me with this blank expression. I kept screaming, telling him to get out, but he didn't react. It was like he was in some sort of trance. The seconds dragged on like hours, and the whole time, I was convinced that at any moment he was going to lunge at me. I had no weapon, nothing to defend myself with if he decided to attack. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. It wasn't long before the flashing lights from a patrol car filled the windows. When Tyler heard the sirens, something in him shifted. He turned and walked out of my room, disappearing into the hallway. I stayed on the phone with the operator, not daring to move from my bed, terrified that he might come back. A few minutes later, I heard the police banging on my door, shouting for him to come out. They arrested him just outside my apartment. I could hear them struggling with him, his voice finally breaking through the silence. He was screaming now, cursing at the police, at me, at everyone. I stayed in my room, clutching my phone, trying to hold myself together. The officers came in after they had him in custody. They asked me questions, walked through my apartment, trying to piece together what had happened. Tyler had been inside my apartment for hours, apparently. They found evidence that he had broken in earlier that evening and had been waiting for me to fall asleep. He hadn't touched anything. Nothing was out of place, but just knowing that he had been there, watching me sleep, shattered any sense of safety I had. After the police left, I didn't know what to do. I sat on my bed, staring at the spot where Tyler had been standing, replaying the night over and over in my head. How long had he been watching me? Why hadn't he done anything? What was he planning? I couldn't stay in that apartment after that night. I packed a bag and stayed with a friend for a few days, trying to figure out my next move. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Tyler standing at the foot of my bed, just watching me. The image haunted me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I was constantly on edge, convinced that he was going to come back, that he would find me, no matter where I went. The police charged him with breaking and entering, but the legal process was slow. They couldn't hold him for long, and eventually he was released on bail. I was given a restraining order, but it felt like nothing more than a piece of paper. It didn't make me feel any safer. Tyler had already found his way into my home once. What was stopping him from doing it again? I moved out of that apartment as soon as I could. Found a place across town, in a different neighborhood. I made sure this new place had better security. Double locks, security cameras, the works. But even with all of that, I never really felt safe. Every creak, every sound in the middle of the night would send me into a panic. I kept my phone on me at all times, my finger hovering over the emergency call button just in case. For months, I didn't feel like myself. I didn't want to go out, didn't want to see anyone. I isolated myself, convinced that Tyler was still watching me somehow. It's been a year now, and while things have improved, I'm still living with the aftermath of that night. It's like a weight I can't shake. I lived in Seattle when this occurred. I had been in the city for about 5 years. Moved there for work after college. It's a beautiful city. The kind of place where you feel like you can lose yourself in the foggy mornings and the constant hum of life around you. I loved it at first. It was a fresh start, far away from where I grew up, and I made a good group of friends. Life was normal, uneventful even, and I was happy with that. I met Brad through mutual friends, and things took off quickly. At first, he was charming, funny, the kind of guy who lights up a room when he walks in. We got along great, and for a while, things were good between us. But as time went on, little things started creeping in that I should have paid more attention to. He became possessive, obsessive even, about small things. He'd question why I was talking to certain people, get upset if I didn't reply to his texts immediately, or accuse me of being distant if I needed space. I ignored the warning signs because, at the time, I thought he just cared about me a lot. I made excuses for his behavior, as people often do when they're in too deep to see the red flags. The relationship started to take a toll on me. I felt like I couldn't breathe without Brad needing to know where I was or what I was doing. He'd demand access to my phone, which I stupidly gave him, and it became this constant surveillance. When I finally had enough, I ended things. It wasn't a dramatic breakup. No big blowout fight. I just told him I needed space, that it wasn't working for me anymore. He took it hard, but I thought that would be the end of it. We went our separate ways, and I thought I was free. For a few weeks after the breakup, I felt like I was starting to get back to myself. I reconnected with friends, went out more, tried to enjoy the single life. Things were going well. Then, out of nowhere, strange things started happening online. It started small, almost unnoticeable at first. One day, I got a message from an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. She asked if everything was okay, said I seemed off in the emails I'd been sending her. I was confused because I hadn't sent her any emails. When I checked, sure enough, there were emails in my sent folder that I didn't recognize. Weird, cryptic messages sent to random people from my contact list. I figured it was just a hacking attempt or some phishing scam, so I changed my passwords and moved on. But that didn't stop it. Over the next few weeks, more and more people started reaching out to me, asking what was going on. They were getting strange messages from me on Facebook, Twitter, even my work email. People were concerned, saying the things I was sending them were out of character, some of them downright disturbing. I didn't understand how this was happening. I was careful with my passwords, used two-factor authentication for everything, but somehow someone had access to my accounts. I contacted the platforms trying to explain what was happening, but all they did was tell me to reset my passwords and check for suspicious activity. I did all of that, but the messages kept coming. The worst part was, whoever was doing this seemed to know exactly how to hurt me. They weren't just sending random spam. They were crafting messages that were personal, messages that made it seem like I was lashing out at people, sharing secrets that I'd only told to a few close friends. It was like someone was trying to tear apart my life from the inside. That's when I started to suspect Brad. I don't know why it hadn't occurred to me earlier, but once the thought crossed my mind, it was all I could think about. Brad had always been good with computers, better than good actually. He worked in IT, and he'd shown me some of the things he could do, like hacking into Wi-Fi networks and bypassing security settings. At the time, I thought it was cool. Now it just terrified me. I tried to confront him, but I couldn't reach him. His number was disconnected and his social media accounts were gone. It was like he had vanished. I even went to his apartment one day, but someone else was living there. Brad had moved out without a trace. I didn't know what to do, so I went to the police. I explained the situation, told them I thought my ex was hacking into my accounts and impersonating me online. They listened, but there wasn't much they could do. Without solid proof, they couldn't pursue it as a crime. They told me to be careful, to document everything, and to change my passwords again. It felt like a dead end. Meanwhile, things were spiraling out of control. Brad, or whoever was behind this, started sending messages to my family. My mom called me in a panic one night saying she'd gotten an email from me that didn't make any sense. It was filled with strange, angry rants about things I'd never said. Things that made me sound completely unhinged. She asked if I was okay, but I didn't know how to explain it to her. I felt helpless. Then things took an even darker turn. One day, I tried to log into my bank account and I couldn't. My password had been changed, and when I called the bank, they told me that several large transfers had been made from my account over the past few days. Thousands of dollars gone just like that. I felt like the ground was slipping out from under me. My entire life was being dismantled piece by piece, and I had no way to stop it. I changed my passwords again, put freezes on my accounts, did everything I could to secure my digital life, but it didn't matter. Whoever was behind this seemed to be one step ahead of me at every turn. They would lock me out of my accounts, send messages to people pretending to be me, even create new accounts in my name. It was like I was losing my identity, bit by bit, to this invisible force that I couldn't fight. I started becoming paranoid. I couldn't trust my own phone, my own computer. I'd get strange texts from numbers I didn't recognize, emails from addresses that looked familiar but weren't quite right. It was like being haunted by a ghost that knew everything about me, but instead of just scaring me, it was destroying my life. One night, I was lying in bed, unable to sleep, when I heard a noise outside my window. It was faint, like someone shuffling in the bushes. My heart started racing, and I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police. But when I looked outside, there was no one there, just the dark street, empty and silent. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew that whoever was doing this wasn't just content with ruining my life online. I started to wonder if Brad, or whoever it was watching me, stalking me, waiting for the right moment to escalate things even further. I installed security cameras around my apartment, but that didn't help much. Every time I checked the footage, I'd get this eerie feeling that someone had been there just out of view, watching. I couldn't prove it, but the feeling never left me. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly on edge, waiting for the next attack to come. At some point, I stopped going out altogether. I couldn't face people, couldn't bear the thought of what they might be thinking about me. My reputation had been trashed by the messages and posts that had been sent in my name. Friends stopped reaching out, and even at work, things became strained. I could tell my coworkers were avoiding me, whispering behind my back. I tried explaining the situation to my boss, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. How could I expect anyone to believe me when I barely believed it myself? I started having panic attacks. There were days when I couldn't even get out of bed. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering how my life had come to this. I had been happy once. I had friends, a job I loved, a life that felt solid and secure. And now it was all falling apart. I felt like I was slipping through the cracks, disappearing into a digital nightmare that I couldn't escape from. I considered moving, disappearing, starting over somewhere new. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't solve anything. Whoever was doing this could find me no matter where I went. They didn't need to be physically close to me to ruin my life. They had access to everything, my bank accounts, my emails, my social media. They knew more about me than I knew about myself. The police couldn't help me, and I couldn't afford a lawyer. So I did the only thing I could think of. I disconnected. I shut down my accounts, got rid of my phone, and stopped using the internet altogether. It wasn't easy. Everything is online these days. But I had no other choice. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next attack to come. It's been months now, and I'm still trying to rebuild my life. I've started using the internet again, but I'm careful, paranoid even. I don't use my real name anymore, and I avoid social media like the plague. Currently, I only use Reddit and nothing else. This began after my breakup with Brian. We had been together for nearly 2 years, and at the start, everything seemed perfect. I thought we were on the same page, that we had the same goals, the same plans for the future. But as time went on, things got complicated. He became more possessive, less trusting. We fought over stupid things, who I was texting, why I wasn't spending every weekend with him, why I wanted a night out with my friends instead of him. At first, I tried to work through it, convincing myself that it was just the rough patch every couple goes through. But eventually, it became too much. I felt suffocated. And when it became clear he wasn't going to change, I left. It wasn't an explosive breakup. There were tears, of course, and some arguing, but nothing that made me feel unsafe. I thought we'd part ways and go on with our lives like adults. Brian didn't fight me on it too much, which surprised me, to be honest. I expected him to make more of a scene, but he didn't. We agreed to go no contact for a while to give each other space to heal, and I felt like I could breathe again. I focused on myself, threw myself into work, and even started seeing someone new after a few months. His name was Alex, and things with him felt different. He was kind, understanding, patient, everything that Brian hadn't been in the end. We started off slowly, getting to know each other, and for the first time in a while, I felt like things were going well. I wasn't rushing into anything, and Alex didn't pressure me. It was easy, but that's when the weird things started happening. I remember the first message that Alex showed me. It was an anonymous text that just said, "She's lying to you." That was it. No context, no explanation. We both laughed it off, assuming it was some kind of spam, or maybe someone with the wrong number. It didn't seem like a big deal. But then more messages started coming. At first, they were vague, cryptic things like, "She's not who she says she is," or "Ask her about her past." The more they came, the more uncomfortable it became. Alex tried to ignore them, but eventually the messages got more specific. Someone had found out details about my life, where I worked, who my friends were, even small things like the places I went to eat on the weekends. They sent Alex screenshots of fake conversations, doctored to look like I was talking to other guys behind his back. The photos were blurry, the text obviously manipulated, but it was enough to plant seeds of doubt. I remember the first time Alex confronted me about it. I was sitting on his couch flipping through Netflix when he just blurted out, he asked me if there's something I want to tell him. The question caught me off guard, and for a second I didn't know what he meant. Then he showed me the messages. There were fake screenshots of conversations between me and some guy named Ryan, where I was apparently talking about how I was just stringing Alex along and wasn't actually serious about him. It was clearly fake. None of the details matched up with my life, and the grammar wasn't even how I wrote. But Alex was visibly upset, and I couldn't blame him. I tried to reassure him, to explain that someone was messing with us, but the doubt had already crept in. It was like a wedge had been driven between us, and no matter how much I explained, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe there was something more to it. Maybe I wasn't being entirely honest with him. It hurt to see him second-guessing me, but I couldn't figure out where this was coming from. The messages didn't stop. They started coming more frequently, sometimes multiple times a day. Anonymous texts, emails, even social media messages from fake accounts. Each one had some new piece of evidence meant to make me look like a liar, like I was cheating on Alex. They even started sending him manipulated photos, showing me with other guys in places I'd never been. It was absurd, but the constant barrage of messages started wearing him down. It wasn't just Alex who was getting the messages either. My friends started receiving them too. I'd get texts from people asking me what was going on, why I was talking trash about them behind their backs, why I was being two-faced. I had no idea what they were talking about until they showed me the screenshots they had been sent. Someone was impersonating me online, sending messages to my friends, stirring up drama, making it look like I was spreading rumors or talking badly about them. It was like someone was trying to isolate me, cut me off from everyone I cared about. At first, I thought it was just some random troll. Maybe someone with too much time on their hands, or some bot that had latched on to me for whatever reason. But then I started to think about Brian. The messages had started not long after we broke up, and the level of detail this person knew about my life was too specific to be random. Whoever it was knew things that only someone close to me would know. And Brian had always been good with computers, better than most people anyway. He'd talked about coding and hacking before, though I never paid much attention to it at the time. Now it seemed to make sense. I tried reaching out to Brian, but he didn't respond. I called him, texted him, even sent him an email, but it was like he had vanished. I went to his apartment, but the landlord told me he had moved out a few weeks after we broke up. I started to panic. What if Brian had been behind all of this? What if he was the one sending the messages, manipulating the photos, trying to destroy my life from behind the scenes? The thought made me sick to my stomach, but I couldn't prove it. And without proof, there wasn't much I could do. Things with Alex started falling apart. No matter how much I reassured him that the messages were fake, That someone was trying to sabotage us? He couldn't shake the doubt. It wore on him, and I could see him pulling away from me. We started fighting more often, and eventually he admitted that he wasn't sure if he could trust me anymore. The constant stream of messages had gotten into his head, and he couldn't look at me the same way. I tried to hold on to the relationship, but it was slipping through my fingers. After a few more weeks of tension, Alex broke up with me. He said it wasn't because of the messages, but I knew that wasn't true. They had done their damage. Losing Alex was a punch to the gut. I felt like I had been blindsided by this invisible force, something I couldn't fight back against because I didn't know where it was coming from. My relationship was destroyed, and my friendships were hanging by a thread. The messages kept coming, and no matter how much I tried to explain to people that they weren't real, some of them started to believe it. They believed the lies. I went to the police, but they couldn't do much without concrete evidence. I showed them the messages, the fake photos, but all they could do was tell me to document everything and block the numbers. That didn't stop the messages from coming, though. It felt like a losing battle. Eventually, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started digging into Brian's life, trying to figure out where he had gone after he moved out. It wasn't easy. He had scrubbed most of his online presence. But I found out through a mutual friend that he had moved to a different part of the city, working a new IT job. I confronted him one day, showing up at his new place. I didn't have a plan, but I was desperate for answers. When he opened the door, he looked shocked to see me. He denied everything, of course. Said he had nothing to do with the messages, that he had moved on and didn't care about my life anymore. But there was something in his eyes, this coldness that hadn't been there before. He didn't seem angry or upset, just indifferent. I didn't believe him, but there was nothing I could do. I left his place feeling more lost than ever. The messages slowed down after that, but they never completely stopped. Every now and then, I'd get a random email or text, another reminder that someone was still out there watching, waiting to strike again. I don't know if I'll ever know for sure if Brian was behind it all. It's strange how much time has passed since things ended with Kevin. It feels like it was both yesterday and a lifetime ago. We were together for nearly 3 years, and for most of that time, I thought everything was pretty normal. I mean, he was attentive, maybe a little *2* attentive, but that wasn't necessarily a red flag for me at the time. It just seemed like he cared. I've always been a private person. Growing up, I learned not to share too much about myself. Maybe that's why I stayed with him as long as I did. He was the kind of person who wanted to know everything about me. But in the end, it wasn't about knowing me. It was about control. When I broke up with him, I didn't think much of it, really. It wasn't this big dramatic thing. I was just done. Kevin had this way of always wanting to know what was going on in my head. It started off innocently enough. Little things like asking about my day, wanting to know what I was thinking about when I got quiet. But over time, it became too much. I didn't notice the shift right away. It wasn't until after we broke up that I realized how much of my life he had been cataloging. I didn't block him after the breakup, though maybe I should have. I didn't feel unsafe at first, just relieved. The constant questions, the subtle pushing for more information about my thoughts and feelings, it was exhausting. He wasn't a bad person, not really. At least I didn't think he was. But looking back now, I see how much of what he did was manipulative in a way I couldn't fully grasp at the time. The first time I heard about the journal was a few months after we broke up. One of our mutual friends, Well, mostly his friend, but someone I'd gotten close to during our relationship reached out. She mentioned offhandedly that Kevin had been processing the breakup by journaling, writing down his thoughts and feelings about everything that happened between us. That didn't seem weird to me. Lots of people write about their emotions after a breakup. What bothered me was how much detail she said he was going into. About me, about our relationship, about private conversations that I had thought were just between us. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe he was just working through things in his own way, I told myself. But then I started hearing from other friends, people I hadn't even told about the breakup. They'd make strange comments, things that were so specific and personal that I felt blindsided. Bringing up personal issues I'd confided in Kevin during our relationship. These weren't things I'd share with just anyone, only him. So how did they know? I felt this creeping unease start to settle in. I knew Kevin had been journaling, but it was becoming clear that he wasn't just writing down his feelings. He was writing down everything. Every fight we'd ever had, every vulnerable moment I'd shared, every offhand comment, and somehow he was showing parts of this journal to our mutual friends. I tried to brush it off, told myself I was being paranoid, but it didn't stop. At first I thought it was just miscommunication or maybe gossip. But the things people were saying, they were too specific to be anything other than Kevin's words. It was like he was controlling the narrative of our breakup, making me look unstable, painting himself as the reasonable one who'd had to deal with me. I confronted one of our mutual friends, trying to figure out where they were getting this information from. She hesitated at first, but then admitted that Kevin had shown her parts of his journal, specifically the parts that talked about my issues. She didn't go into detail, but she made it clear that Kevin had portrayed me as deeply troubled, possibly even unstable. I felt sick. This wasn't just some casual journaling. Kevin had been meticulously documenting my life, my thoughts, my insecurities, all while we were together, and now he was using that against me. I couldn't believe it. It felt like a violation of the deepest kind. There was a sense of betrayal, but also fear. How much did he have on me? What had he written down that I didn't even remember saying? I started to look back on our relationship in a different light. All those times when he'd asked me probing questions, when he'd wanted to know every little thing about my day, when he'd pressed me to share more about my past, it hadn't been out of care or concern. He had been collecting information, storing it away for later use. I had no idea what else he might have written down, or how many people had read these twisted versions of my life. It felt like he was still controlling me, even though we weren't together anymore. I wanted to distance myself from all of it. I blocked Kevin on social media and cut ties with anyone who seemed to be in on this weird, twisted sharing of his journal. But even that didn't stop it. A few weeks later, I got a message from another friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year. She said she had heard about what happened between Kevin and me, that she was sorry things had gone so badly. I asked her what she meant, and she started repeating some of the same distorted stories I'd heard before. Kevin had been telling people that I was paranoid, that I'd been the one who was always keeping tabs on him. He had flipped the narrative entirely, making me sound like the obsessive one. The worst part was I started doubting myself. Maybe I was too private, too closed off. Maybe I hadn't been as open in the relationship as I should have been. I started replaying every interaction we'd had, wondering if I had come across as distant or untrusting. But no matter how many times I went over it, I couldn't shake the feeling that Kevin had been manipulating me from the start. He had always known how to push my buttons, how to make me doubt myself, how to turn my insecurities against me. I became hyper-aware of everything I said to people. I didn't know who had read his journal or how far this had spread. Every conversation felt loaded with hidden meaning, like people were looking at me through the lens of his words, not my own. I started keeping more to myself, not trusting anyone with personal information. I felt like I was constantly on guard, afraid that anything I said could be twisted and used against me. The worst part was the feeling of being watched, even when Kevin wasn't physically around. He had gotten so deep into my head that I started second-guessing everything I did. I didn't feel safe in my own skin anymore, like my thoughts weren't really my own. Every time I let my guard down, I imagined Kevin writing it all down, waiting to use it against me. I stopped going out as much, stopped seeing people who had any connection to Kevin. I moved out of my apartment in Logan Square and found a new place in Wicker Park, hoping a change of scenery would help. But the feeling followed me. It didn't matter where I went. Kevin had already done the damage. His words had poisoned the way people saw me, and even though we weren't in contact, I couldn't shake the fear that he was still finding ways to get to me. I'd hear from people every now and then, old friends, acquaintances, people I hadn't spoken to in years, telling me they'd heard about me through the grapevine. It felt like Kevin's journal had taken on a life of its own, spreading through our social circles like a virus. It didn't matter that we weren't together anymore. His version of me had become the dominant one, and there was nothing I could do to change that. I thought about confronting him, demanding that he stop sharing my personal life with others. But I knew it wouldn't do any good. Kevin was too smart for that. He'd just twist it around, make me look even more unstable. So I stayed silent, hoping that eventually people would forget about me, forget about his journal, and let me move on with my life. But I still live with the fear that one day I'll run into someone else who's read his version of my life, someone who sees me not as I am, but as Kevin painted me to be.